Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So I don't know whether you've caught on to it yet or not, but many of my videos have some Easter eggs buried in them. And that is that it may be about one particular subject, but I really delve deeper into trying to introduce a new technology which helps you understand your infrastructure just a little bit better. And today is no different. So the main subject is a discussion about Tails, and Tails is a portable operating system that protects against surveillance and censorship, and Tails always starts from the same clean state, and everything you do disappears automatically when you shut down Tails. And when you set up the Tails operating system, normally you boot from an ISO or you boot from a USB image. Tails uses the Tor network because it is the strongest and most popular network to protect from surveillance and censorship. Some web browsers, for example the Brave browser, actually has an option to start a new private window with Tor, and it will actually go in the background and connect to the Tor network, setting up all of the relays, and then anything that you do in terms of a search or running any other software is ostensibly private. But that's not entirely true because you're running it on an operating system, and that operating system tends to leave breadcrumbs behind saying where it is coming from. So Tor, which is the Onion network, is a free overlay network for enabling anonymous communication. And it's open source, and it's been around since probably the early 1990s, although I think that it goes back even further than that. And it was developed by the US Navy, and the idea behind it was basically a way to communicate from other parts of the world where perhaps you wanted to have secure communication, so it certainly had military applications. The Tor network has also received somewhat of a bum rap because it's often referred to as the dark web. And the reason for that is because there is a lot of, let's say, below board communication taking place on it. That being said, there's nothing implicitly illegal about communicating over a Tor network, i.e. the dark web. And in fact, in 2021, I presented a presentation entitled Self-Hosting on the Dark Side, which talked about how to stand up a server on the dark web or on the Onion network. And as I mentioned earlier, Tor is an overlaid network. I don't look at it really as being another network per se. I just look at it as a different means of communication. So for example, TCP/IP version 4 is one way to communicate over the internet. TCP/IP version 6 is a completely different way to communicate over a network. And likewise, you can look at Tor in a similar way. The reason I'm making this presentation today is that prior to Incus version 6.16, we didn't really have a way to run Tails in Incus as an Incus VM. And so version 6.16 of Incus introduced a number of changes, and here about 2 weeks ago I presented a presentation on the TrueNAS storage driver for Incus, which was one significant addition to Incus. And more recently, I presented one entitled Super Easy Windows 11 Install in an Incus VM. And that particular one showed how you can use the CD Rom handling for virtual machines which was added to Incus version 6.16. And it's this feature plus another that I'm going to present today. Modern operating systems boot with something called UEFI, or Universal Extensible Firmware Interface. And it's basically a software interface that replaces the traditional ROM BIOS used for so many years. And part of that specification is a protocol that Microsoft introduced called Secure Boot. And what Secure Boot does is it verifies that the operating system being booted are signed drivers and has a signed signature on that machine. Translation, it is authorized to boot on that hardware. And even if you have a computer sitting in front of you, if Secure Boot is turned on, you can't grab a CD Rom or a USB bootable device and boot from that machine as long as Secure Boot is enabled. So in the computing industry, we know that the only truly secure computer is the one that's still on order. But that being said, if you want a fairly secure computer, you're going to place it in a secure location. For example, a locked computer room. But a server that is out in a public area or a desktop out in a public area, despite having something like Secure Boot turned on, as long as someone has physical access to the hardware, they have the ability to reset the BIOS settings in order to gain access to the system, or perhaps even physically remove the hard drive itself. And yes, I know that they can encrypt the hard drive, but the point is that really security should not rely on something like Secure Boot. I look at it as simply being a band-aid. So in this tutorial, we are specifically not going to use Secure Boot. And one other thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at something called the SeaBIOS. And so SeaBIOS is an open source implementation of an x86 BIOS. And Incus virtual machines have the capability to boot with the Legacy ROM and use the SeaBIOS as their ROM BIOS. Here I am on my desktop computer, which also happens to be an Incus server, and I'm going to begin by doing a wget on the installation media for Tails, which is an ISO disk image or an image of a CD ROM. Just like in my video entitled Super Easy Windows 11 Install in an Incus Virtual Machine, we are going to also create an empty virtual machine with the command incus init tails --empty --vm. And what that does is it creates an Incus virtual machine, but an Incus virtual machine without any operating system. Next, we need to add our CD-ROM image to our Incus virtual machine, and we do so with an Incus config device add tails, and then the word install is just an arbitrary name for our installation disk. We use the keyword disk because we're defining a disk, and then the source of that disk is the absolute pathway all the way down to the Tails ISO that we just downloaded. Beginning with Incus version 6.16, we have the IO.bus equals to USB, which will recognize that device as a CD-ROM, which is a prerequisite for Tails to operate properly. And since it is a CD-ROM, I'm setting read-only equals to true. And then finally, a really important part about this is setting boot.prereq priority equals to 10, and that sets the CD-ROM media as having a higher boot priority than the internal disk, which is created by default a 10 gigabyte disk actually when we do an Incus init tails -- empty -- VM, which we're not planning to use. Prior to Incus version 6.16, when I would try to get tails to boot, it would not boot because it did not recognize the media as a CD-ROM. But now, with the new capability in 6.16, it does recognize that media properly. So the next step we have here is Incus config set tails security.csm equals to true and security.secureboot equals false, and then limits.memory equals 6 gigabytes. Security.csm equals to true means that the compatibility support module has been enabled, which is the virtual firmware to run in Legacy BIOS boot mode. And again, as a reminder, that means that it's going to boot the Open Source SeaBIOS, which is an implementation of an x86 BIOS that supports booting non-UEFI, which is a requirement for tails. Since Incus virtual machines normally boot via UEFI, that means that they have secure boot enabled by default. And since we're booting in legacy mode, we have to explicitly turn secure boot off with security.secureboot equals to false. Finally, I want to explicitly set limits.memory equals to 6 gigabytes, and I did some testing with the Tails operating system, and although it ran pretty well with 4 gigabytes, it ran just a little bit faster with 6 gigabytes. At this point, we're ready to start Tails, and we're going to do so with an Incus start tails -- console equals VGA, which will bring up the Incus remote virtual machine viewer. So now we have that up and running, and it boots Tails by default. And so it's out there looking at the Tails media, and here it begins the boot process. After a relatively short period of time, you get this welcome to Tails screen that gives you an option to set your language, your keyboard layout, and your formats. And so since I'm in the United States, I'm not going to make any changes to this. It also gives you the option to set up persistent storage. It is my recommendation that you do not do this because this just flies in the face of having an operating system that stores no permanent data and leaves no tracks. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and click Start Tails. Once Tails starts up, it may give you a warning about having a virtual machine, and that may be a little less secure, but in our case, it's not because we're not planning to have anything persistent. We're booting from that read-only CD-ROM every time we launch Tails. So the first thing that comes up is asking you about your Tor connection. And I'm just going to go ahead and say connect to the Tor network automatically and click connection to Tor. That will go out and synchronize to Tor and go ahead and create the entry nodes and exit nodes that are characteristic of the Onion router. Once you're connected to the Tor network, you get this verification screen that tells you that you are connected to Tor successfully. You have an option to view your Tor circuits, and that will go ahead and show you the various Onion circuits and how everything is connected. And then you can go ahead and click Start the Tor browser. This video is not really to instruct you how to use Tails, and it's also not how to use Tor in general. I just found it kind of interesting when this browser comes up, and there's plenty of documentation to explain things for you. I thought it was interesting that if I went ahead and went out onto the regular network and went to something like Amazon.com as an example, here you can see that it says delivered to Netherlands, and that means that one of our exit nodes is in Netherlands. And prior to this, when I did that command, I was actually in Antarctica, so I found that interesting. What that lets you know is it lets you know that there is an exit node located in Antarctica, no doubt at one of the research stations. In terms of Tails itself, there is an application menu, and they do have a number of different security tools and utilities out here, and it's a very basic operating system. Once you're done using the Tails operating system, you can just come up here and say power off, and when you power off, it will exit the virtual machine viewer and go back to the terminal. And if we want to launch it again, we simply do another Incus start Tails -- console equals VGA. And again, just as a reminder, this video was not specifically about Tails. It was about showing how you can use the legacy boot mode to boot a virtual machine in Incus, and it was also about how to use the new CD Rom drivers in Incus version 6.16 to boot that legacy image, and in this case it just happened to be that operating system Tails. And this could not have been done prior to the release of version 6.16. Anyway, thank you for watching today, and I hope you will like and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.